storyteller. I love telling stories. I tell stories when I preach. I tell stories when I teach. I tell stories when I'm hanging out with a group of people in a social situation. I love telling stories. But there's a problem with certain stories that I tell. These are the ones that I sometimes tell myself. These are stories about people based on incomplete information. Now, I climb a whole ladder of assumptions that are often quite wrong, and this happens at work and it happens at home, and I can make up great stories in my head. Now, it always starts with a fact, but soon assumptions begin to creep in. One time I can think of, I was presenting a new initiative to the staff about something that I wanted to do, just a great program that we were going to launch. I was so excited about it, and so I was gathered everybody together, and I'm telling them all about this program. And there was this one staff member, I'll call him Tom, since we don't have any Toms on the staff. And Tom was texting and emailing through my entire presentation. How dare him, right? And so here I am, and I'll just walk over to the ladder to demonstrate this. I've got this one fact that Tom is emailing and texting on his smartphone while I am trying to inspire the staff with this great new initiative that we have. So quickly, I make the assumption that Tom is not really interested in what I have to say and thinks he has better things to do. Then I draw the conclusion, see how the ladder works? Then I draw the conclusion that Tom is not really behind my vision for what's going to be going on this church year and this initiative. So then, after that, I develop a belief that I need to start working around Tom because Tom's not really on my team. And who needs people who are not supportive and who are bringing negativity to a new initiative? So the next step would be to take action based on these assumptions, conclusions, and beliefs. And so, for example, in this case, I might stop inviting Tom to meetings because I don't want to have that kind of energy around when I'm doing these kinds of things. Now, this stuff happens at home too. I can think of a time when I was coming home after a really hard day of work, and my wife had prepared a delicious dinner. We had a relative who was visiting us, and so we had this lovely dinner. Now, it was my turn to do the dishes, and I knew that it was my turn to do the dishes. However, after a long day, I was tired, and so I decided to go retire on the couch and put my feet up for a few minutes before going back to do the dishes. Now, that was fine until this relative, I'll say in-law, keep it generic. I'll keep it generic. This in-law saunters into the kitchen, and I notice a sort of unpleasant look on this person's face as this person peers at me on the couch with my feet up. And I'm sitting there thinking, see, this is where my wife gets this whole attitude about, you don't relax until you've got all the things done that you're supposed to do. And so I'm fuming because it gets worse. Because this in-law then starts to do the dishes that I'm supposed to be doing right in front of me, looking at me, and I'm thinking, here we go, right up the ladder. I'm thinking, this in-law thinks I'm lazy and a procrastinator. So after making that assumption, then I draw the conclusion that this in-law is doing these dishes with a sense of condensation and judgment. I could hear it, like in the squeaking of the soap and the sponge, all the condescension and everything. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I get this belief that how dare this person come into my home and make me feel bad when I've already had a hard day and I'm just trying to relax a little bit before I do the dishes. So I'm going to take some action later, and I'm going to tell my wife that if her in-law wants to come visit us in the future, that she needs to explain to this in-law that I don't like being made to feel like a lazy, no good husband after I've had a long, hard day at work. You see what I'm saying? I am a really big storyteller. And I can make up all kinds of stories in my head. But here's what I want to talk to you about today. I've been taking this leadership class all year. It's called an Integral Leadership Class. The name of the organization is called Stagen. And they've taught us to pay attention to the stories that we're telling ourselves and to check them out with the people about whom we're telling the stories. Now, I will tell you that it's not always comfortable, and like blowing bubbles that we saw earlier, it can be a little bit messy, and it takes a little courage to actually go in and check out your story with people. And so, in the first case, I go to talk to this employee, and I say, Tom, I want to check something out with you. I noticed that you were texting and you were emailing while I was giving my presentation the other day, and I've started to tell myself a story that you're not really behind my vision of the church for this year. And guess what I find out? I find out that Tom was actually so excited about this new initiative that he couldn't contain himself, and so he was immediately started to text and to email people on his board and committee, lay leaders, to get them behind this new initiative that he was so excited about. You see, it's dangerous up there at the top of the ladder of assumptions, because here I was telling myself a story that I could have damaged the relationship with somebody who was actually a key supporter of what I was trying to accomplish, but I had developed such a story in my head about what he was about, what he was doing, and I could have made decisions and taken actions that would have really undermined him and us and what we were trying to do. So you want to hear what happened at home? You probably already have figured it out. I was a little slow on the uptake here, but this in-law saw me sitting there, could tell that I had had a hard day, and out of a great sense of gratitude and thankfulness for all I do for the family, decided to help me out by doing the dishes. So the stories we tell ourselves are often far from the reality that we're actually living. I had built a whole story on some small piece of information. It was a fact to begin with, but it quickly became something more. So here's what I really want to say, is that love can be found in the gaps between the stories we are telling and the realities that we are living. A lot of times when we're in conflict with other people, it's because of these gaps in our stories. But if we can risk exposing the gaps, entering them, we can discover a profound love in that space between us. Now, it takes self-awareness, of course, and it takes courage to admit that we don't know everything we think we know. Maybe the hardest part about it all. Yet, the more that we're willing to risk to tell our stories and to listen to other people's stories, the more confidence that we'll have that love shows up in these moments, in these times, and can change and transform what we're doing. There is a lot of love and a lot of life that we can only experience if we're willing to enter those gaps in our lives between us and other people, between us and our own stories. So this idea of storytelling and this idea of closing the gaps between the stories we tell, both individually but also collectively, and the realities that we live in and the truths of our world and our lives is going to be a framework that we're going to be using throughout this entire church year at many levels of church life with our children and in programs and classes and sermons throughout this entire year around storytelling and closing the gap. So this is about a year of cultivating our own faith in love's power to show up between us in these gaps and in these places of disconnection in our lives. Sometimes it's between what we want and what's happening in our lives. There's a gap. The vision we have for what we expect out of being a parent, out of being on a job, on a team, in a marriage, and the reality that we're in. There's often a gap. And if we're willing to talk about and share our story and enter that gap together and trust that love, that spirit, that God, if you will, that life, for some miracle, some magic, will come into that space and hold us and help us and heal us and allow us to go deeper into our own experience of the world. Last year, Dave Ruffin and some others, Kelly McLeod-Shingen and Tony Willis and Carmen Yannick and some other church folks taught a class on storytelling for justice. Did you take it? Anyone here take it? So I see a few hands in the back. Everybody I talked to who took that class last year talked about some profound experience that they had either from hearing someone else's story or from hearing their own story in a new way when they shared it in that class. And we're going to be doing more of those classes this year, so I highly recommend that program to you and the small groups and the other things that we're doing this year to allow people to have some of these experiences. Now, the big macro story that we tell as a nation is the American dream story, right? That anyone who works hard enough can get ahead and be successful in this country. And successful people who are ahead or are getting ahead find it very easy to believe this story on face value. Now, not only because of our experience of being ahead or getting ahead, but also because there are so many inspiring stories out there about people who grew up in a disadvantaged or poor situation and have risen through the corporate ladder or have become internet millionaires or in some other way have created an incredible life and seen an amazing shift in their social and economic location in this country. And it is truly something that is amazing about our country and our culture is that there is a lot of opportunities for social mobility in a way that we have not seen in other societies throughout human civilization. So it's not that that's not true. However, it's not the whole story. I can think of ways in which that story denies other people's stories and denies other people's realities and sometimes even denies other people's dignity. And so I want to just share one story about a sexton who was working here when I first came to All Souls 15 years ago. And he was working 3 jobs, I found out after a while. He would finish here after a full day, 8-hour day of manual labor, and would go over to a manufacturing company and work in the factory until 2 a.m. He'd go home, get a bite to eat, get a few hours of sleep, and he'd be back here at 8:30 in the morning. And then on weekends, he had another part-time job that he worked as well. I'll call him George. George used to talk about how when he came to this country, he was expecting to take some classes. I think was interested in becoming a medical technician in some field, had been doing some studies before coming here. And but then had a family and things didn't work out. And so was doing everything he could to make ends meet. Now this is a guy who had incredible values, just super nice guy, would give you the shirt off his back and was just kind and very, very hardworking, diligent. in all those ways. But he was just trying to survive, and his family were in any way getting ahead. In fact, they were doing everything they could not to fall further behind. And when you think about how some people would look at him, people who accept the American dream story on face value, they could and often do walk up the ladder of assumption and start with the fact that this guy's not really getting ahead very much. They might assume that he's lazy or not very smart or not very industrious. And maybe they would conclude that he's not trying hard enough. If he were, he'd be successful. And they would likely believe that he's not someone that they would consider exactly an equal to them, someone that they would necessarily see as their peer, especially if they're more financially well off or successful. And they might act on those assumptions, conclusions, and beliefs by not really giving him the time of day, not respecting him, or not really seeing him for who he really is. So part of living in the gaps is also paying attention to the people who we're not supposed to pay attention to. Quote unquote, supposed to pay attention to. But be assured that love shows up in those spaces between us, especially between us and people who are very different from us and who have very different stories than us. If we're willing to face the discomfort of having some of those conversations. Now, by George telling his story, and by me, even by me and us amplifying this story today, we begin to close the gap between the story of the American dream and the reality of America. Storytelling can be an act of resistance. It can be an act of justice making. Storytelling changes our lives and can change our world. Storytelling brings awareness to the spaces in our lives, the spaces between us, the spaces between truth and reality, and the ways in which we sometimes perceive the world. And it is in those places and in those spaces that love, in a very profound way, you could say God, if you believe in God, that spirit that makes things happen that are unexpected, makes things happen that you just would not anticipate happening. But those kinds of things happen when we learn to walk into those gaps together with other people and with ourselves. So it's about not being afraid and building confidence that when we enter those gaps in our lives, in our own story and our stories with others, that there is a spirit, there is a power, there is a love that will show up and transform us. But we have to be willing to admit sometimes that this marriage needs help, that my child is struggling, that I'm struggling, that this project may fail, that I don't know if our plans are going to turn out, that my life is not turning out the way I expected it to turn out, or being a grandparent isn't exactly what I imagined it was going to be like. To say any of these kinds of things is to enter that space and or at least to acknowledge that space. And when we do, I want to say miracles happen, by which I mean love breaks through, inspiration breaks in, something new and unexpected happens. But as Barbara said earlier, it doesn't just happen on its own. We have to do something to help it along. In Judaism, there's a midrash, which is a word for commentary about the story of the parting of the Red Sea. When the Jews come down to the Red Sea and they're stuck and the Egyptian army's behind them and they're trying to escape slavery and bondage, and the story is told that God parts the sea, one of the miracle stories. God parts the sea and the Jews are able to get to freedom. Well, in this midrash, they say that God doesn't part the waters until the people have faith and actually start walking in to the sea. And in this midrash, the only one willing to walk in first is Miriam and some of the other women. which doesn't surprise me because it's often women who will have the courage to lead us in new directions in our own lives and in our communities and in our world. So Miriam walks in, and it's after her taking that step and having that faith, having that confidence, that the sea parts and the miracle happens. And I just want to say that this year is about us remembering our own stories, remembering how love and God and people and community and other things have shown up for us in those gap moments in our lives. So that as we remember our own stories and as we teach our children about these stories, we begin to cultivate our own confidence, our own trust, our own faith in life, in ourselves, and in love's power to hold us and to heal us and to transform us and our community. We want our children to grow up with that sense so that when their life meets some disconnect, when someone breaks their heart or things don't quite work out, that they have grown up with a community of people who have taught them and shown them and reminded them and given them the experience that when we're in those moments, love shows up. Because to live in the world with that kind of faith makes living so much more fun, palatable, possible in so many ways. You know, in my life, I have had some big disconnects that I can think of. And I can think of the ways that love has shown up. Nothing obviously bigger than losing a child. But in that experience, the incredible love and spirit that came through people and through prayers and through songs and through nature and in so many ways in my life has given me an incredible confidence that allows me to walk through the world and into different situations and into the gaps and the spaces between, knowing, having faith that when I do, I won't be alone. There will be a love and a power and a source of strength to hold me. And I want everyone to have that kind of faith in love's power to transform our lives and to transform our world. So Happy New Year. I love you. Amen. Thanks for tuning in online. We are so pleased with all the different people who have been tuning in from all over the country and all over the world. If you have a chance to send me an email or connect with me in some way, let me know what you're finding, why you tune in, and what you're getting out of it. I would love to hear from you. And if you get a chance to make a gift to support this ministry, to become a partner, we would love to partner with you and have you be a friend of the church and somebody who is actually supporting us to create this congregation and the world that we're trying to create together. You can be a part of it, and every gift of every amount makes a difference. We really appreciate your support.